Good evening and welcome to a BIC stream session on Meritocracy and Democracy, the social life of caste in India, with Ajantha Subramanian, Professor of Anthropology and South Asian Studies at the Harvard University, and TM Krishna, musician and author. Thank you, Ajantha and TM Krishna, for doing this session today. This session is based on the book, The Caste of Merit, Engineering Education in India by Ajantha Subramanian. At BIC, we tend to hold discussions around the larger themes of the book, and hence the more generic title was chosen. We got feedback that an earlier image, a painting by artist Gagendranath Tagore, was not reflective of the book discussion. Consequently, we changed the image of the book to the book cover that was displayed earlier. Now, before I invite Professor Ajantha Subramanian to speak, just a few housekeeping announcements. Now, if you look at the bottom of your screen, you will see a chat option and a Q&A option. We request you to press both the chat option as well as the Q&A. We will be using the chat option to post the biodata of both Ajantha Subramanian as well as TM Krishna when they speak. The Q&A is for participants in the room to ask questions. So you could type your questions in the Q&A. For those of you who are watching this on YouTube, you could use the comments page of the YouTube to post your questions, and we will have them posted in the Q&A element within the room out here. So that's about both the chat as well as the Q&A. With these few words, just one more one more announcement about our next event. So this is Dalit History Month. So on Sunday at 6 p.m. again on BIC stream, same time, we are doing a session on Dr. Ambedkar, his legacy and relevance for current times. We have 4 research scholars who would be discussing the subject, and do sign in and you will get the details on our website. Once again, I'd like to thank Ajantha as well as TM Krishna for doing this session. We will initially have Ajantha Subramanian address the group for about 35 to 40 minutes. Post that, TM Krishna will be in conversation with Ajantha for another 25-30 minutes. And the last 20-25 minutes will be to address the Q&A. Ajantha, could you come in?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you so much. I'm delighted to be here. Thanks to Ravi for inviting me and to TM Krishna for agreeing to be a discussant. Thanks also to Lekha and Raghu for dealing with the technical details, which of course have become increasingly more crucial because of the current era of social distancing. As Ravi mentioned, the title of the talk is Meritocracy and Democracy, the Social Life of Caste in India. And the talk encapsulates the arguments of my book, The Caste of Merit, Engineering Education in India. So I'm going to be speaking for about 40 minutes and I'm going to be reading a talk. So I hope it's entertaining enough to hold your attention. In India today, merit is a ubiquitous term that generates a lot of political heat. Over the post-independence period, merit has come to reference forms of distinction that have a much longer social life. And while there are various social distinctions that are at stake in public debates around who does or does not have merit, the most politically charged point of reference is caste. The relationship between caste and merit is widely debated, but nowhere more vocally and consistently than in engineering education. Within the world of Indian engineering education, the institutions seen as most meritocratic are the IITs, which are the focus of my research. A set of originally 5 institutions founded between 1951 and 61 and deemed institutions of national importance by the IIT Act of 1961, the IITs are directly administered and financed by the Indian central government and fall outside the structure of affiliation to universities, which gives them far greater autonomy in institutional functioning, faculty hiring, and curricular development. Their autonomy was guaranteed in other ways as well. In the name of ensuring merit as the only basis for admission, they were originally exempted from reservations policies. Soon after their founding, the IITs became stepping stones to transnational mobility, especially to the United States. The professional and economic success of IIT alumni in both India and the US generated a mad rush to gain admission, pushing the number of candidates steadily upward and spawning a massive coaching industry to train students in exam preparation. Within Indian public discourse, the IITian has become an exemplar of intellectual merit, someone seen as naturally gifted in technical knowledge. What gets occluded in such assessments of the IITian's innate intelligence and competitiveness are the forms of historical advantage that have enabled admission to the IITs. The majority of IITians come from upper caste families of bureaucrats and academics, where capital has long been held in education. While arguably from middle class backgrounds, the value of their accumulated caste capital has spiked due to the reorganization of late 20th and early 21st century capitalism around the knowledge economy. At the same time, the role of caste and of the state in producing IITians has been obscured in favor of their portrayal as uniquely meritorious individuals. The IIT story provokes some important questions. How does historical advantage become merit? How does the naturalization of the IITian's merit inform understandings of caste difference? And what does this mean for the possibilities and limits of democratic transformation in India? Before I turn to the research, let me say a little about my reasons for taking on this project. One of the main aims was to interrogate the widespread assumption that caste is a more salient basis of social distinction and self-definition for lower than for upper castes. More specifically, upper caste urban professionals are thought to have transcended caste to adopt more modern forms of identification. At the same time, professional classes and institutional spaces like the IITs continue to be largely upper caste in composition. Moreover, attempts at opening up these spaces to lower castes are consistently met with fervent opposition, not in the name of caste, but in the name of preserving merit. So despite continuing caste stratification and the claims to merit by upper castes, there is little scholarship that brings these issues together. And this is where my work comes in. I look at the role of engineering education and the IITs in particular in producing claims to merit as expressions of upper caste identity. To get at the relationship between caste and merit, I build on the work of sociologists Pierre Bourdieu and Satish Deshpande. In his essay, The Forms of Capital, Bourdieu offers an insightful analysis of what he calls embodied cultural capital, those accumulated effects of family and class history that become an integral part of the person and are usually recognized not as capital, but as competence. In this way, he says, embodied cultural capital, and this is a quote, manages to combine the prestige of innate property with the merits of acquisition, unquote. He goes on to note that there is an inherent instability to embodied capital that is stabilized through forms of institutional recognition, such as academic qualifications. Such institutional mediation endows cultural capital with greater legitimacy and makes it into a currency more easily traded in the marketplace. Bourdieu's analysis dovetails nicely with the work of Satish Deshpande on how upper castes are rendered casteless in India. The story of how upper castes transform their caste capital into modern capital is not well known, he says, because it runs with the grain of the dominant common sense. When it is seen and heard, it appears to be a story about something other than caste, like the story of nation building, for example. That was a quote. By contrast, the political use of caste by lower castes is a recurrent, publicly debated theme. The result of this asymmetry, Deshpande maintains, is that the upper castes are naturalized as the casteless inheritors of modernity, while lower castes are hyper-visible as the illegitimate purveyors of caste. For upper castes, he concludes, quote, caste qua caste has already yielded all that it can, and represents a ladder that can now be safely kicked away. Having encashed its traditional caste capital and converted it into modern forms of capital like property, higher educational credentials, and strongholds in lucrative professions, this section believes itself to be casteless today, unquote. So my work builds on both Bourdieu and Deshpande, but adds a key component. And this is the relationship between subaltern or lower caste assertion and capital accumulation. Strategies of upper caste capital accumulation, I argue, must be understood in relation to oppositional politics. This allows us to see how caste emerges out of longer historical dynamics and continues to be reconfigured in the context of democratic politics. But it's also to make the larger point that historical advantage does not simply reproduce itself. The proliferation of rights politics and the entry of new groups into social and economic spaces previously monopolized by upper castes have posed real challenges to caste hierarchies. The claim to merit is one strategy aimed at stabilizing the flux of political life in order to secure arenas of expertise and accumulation against lower caste advancement. However, even this claim to merit is not a guarantee and has to be continuously recalibrated in the face of new challenges. My work on the IITs tracks such changing expressions of upper caste identity. While I look at the IIT system as a whole, my main focus is on IIT Madras. Tamil Nadu is a particularly illuminating context in which to look at the relationship between lower caste assertion and upper caste capital accumulation, because its history of caste politics has complicated the naturalization of merit and the transformation of upper caste into casteless moderns. Here, as in other regions with histories of lower caste rights, merit is understood as a product of historical advantage and not simply of innate ability. In this sense, Tamil Nadu calls into question Deshpande's account of castelessness as a stable structure of upper caste self-definition. So departing from Deshpande's analysis, I ask how dynamics in Tamil Nadu might inform an analysis of caste more broadly. When are claims to merit made on the basis of castelessness, and when on the basis of caste? What are the forms of embodied cultural capital that continue to mark status and stigma, even in the absence of explicit invocations of caste? Let me now turn to the research. I'm going to first give you a brief account of the role of caste in colonial technical education, and then turn to IIT Madras and the making of upper caste identity through claims to merit. And for the post-independence period, I will look specifically at three phenomena: reservations, mass examinations, and diasporic mobility, and use each to show how the contours of upper caste identity have shifted in response to new challenges. But first, let's go back to the 19th century. Caste played a critical role in the induction of Indians into formal technical training in the late colonial period. Through the 19th and early 20th centuries, racial barriers to technical education were expressed through a clear preference for engineers from England. It was only with the rise in nationalist criticism of colonial rule and the expansion of public works that the colonial government began to invest more systematically in formal technical education for Indians. The question of what kind of training this would be and what kind of person was best suited for it was hotly debated. From the beginning, we see tensions between two views of engineering. The first expressed an older orientation around engineering as practical learning unsuited to the classroom. The second, newer view argued for the importance of engineering as formal conceptual education, aligned with the social hierarchies of the colony. While this debate endured into the 20th century, the call to formalize engineering as classroom education ultimately won out. Although technical skill was more clearly evident among lower caste artisans and tradesmen, the emerging consensus over engineering as classroom learning and its connection to state power made literate upper caste the principal targets of this new knowledge. In elevating the classroom as the principal site of engineering knowledge, education planners marginalized those who had technique in favor of those schooled in reading and writing. From the outset, we see a convergence between a colonial administrative sociology of caste, the stratification of technical training, and new modes of collective self-representation. Even as upper castes were inducted into modern professions, where secular credentials were ostensibly more important than family and community, the preoccupation with caste-appropriate choices persisted. Rather than a shift from caste to castelessness, the modern engineer was always also a caste self. For their part, colonial officials were happy to accommodate caste prejudices in order to enhance the status and growth of engineering. In effect, upper caste status anxieties and colonial policy dovetailed in consigning those social groups with a history of technical skill to the margins of the growing field of engineering. In many ways, Madras presidency was an extreme case of this caste stratification of technical training. Here, the categories of Brahmin and non-Brahmin had become foundational units of administrative sociology through which technical training was implemented. Through the 1910s, concern with the erosion of non-Brahmin occupations and the need to enhance hereditary skills in wood, metal, and textiles remained a centerpiece of technical education policy in Madras. Such efforts distinguishing non-Brahmin from Brahmin pursuits strengthened and naturalized the link between caste and technical skill. The effects in the engineering field were clear. As the number of Europeans in Madras's engineering profession fell, Brahmins were the single largest group to fill the vacuum, despite being barely 3% of the regional population. The correlation between caste and occupation and the overrepresentation of Brahmins in the modern professions became a rallying cry of the non-Brahmin and Dravidian movements, which profoundly reshaped the Tamil political and social milieu. Within the technical sciences too, the impact of Dravidianism was far-reaching. The Southeast was one of the first regions where caste quotas in technical education and employment were implemented. These measures have had considerable success at changing the caste composition of engineering from the days when Tamil Brahmins filled over 70% of seats in regional engineering colleges. One of the lasting effects of Dravidianism has been a cleavage between Tamil Nadu's other castes and Tamil Brahmins, with caste privilege more closely tied to Brahminness than in many other parts of India. To turn Deshpande's argument on its head, Dravidianism interrupted the translation of caste capital into modern capital by making Brahmins hyper-visible as castes, a move that has been an important catalyst for a more far-reaching politics of meritocracy. An early moment where we see the impact of Dravidianism is 1951, with the first post-independence legal challenge to caste quotas. Two Tamil Brahmin petitioners claimed that their fundamental right to equality and non-discrimination, guaranteed by Article 15(1) of the Constitution, was violated by regional quotas in medical and engineering colleges. The Madras High Court agreed. In a key passage, the judgment stated, quote, "It may be that through the fortuitous operation of a rule, which in itself is not discriminatory, a special advantage is enjoyed by some citizens belonging to a particular caste or community. This advantage is not taken away by Article 15(1). If students belonging to a certain community or caste, by reason of their caste discipline, habits, and modes of life, satisfy the prescribed requirements in larger number than others, it is not permissible to shut them out on that score. It would be strange if, in this land of equality and liberty, a class of citizens should be constrained to wear the badge of inferiority because, forsooth, they have a greater aptitude for certain types of education than other classes," unquote. The judgment redefined caste in two ways: from a system of graded inequality into community life, and from a form of historical advantage into collective aptitude. Moreover, it identified the quota itself as the source of discrimination. Deshpande argues that the 1951 verdict offered upper castes a form of agency, quote, "based on the universal normative position of castelessness. Constitutionally and legally, caste was henceforth to be recognized only as a source of disadvantage or vulnerability not as a source of privilege or advantage, unquote. As such, he continues, it, quote, authored and disseminated a new kind of common sense, where the very definition of caste was truncated and equated with the lower castes, unquote. Significantly, this common sense only deepened after the courts shifted in favor of quotas. Those who qualified for quotas were included in the reserved category on the basis of their caste affiliation, whereas those who did not qualify were simply classed under the general category of merit-based admissions. This absenting of caste from the general category has profoundly shaped the debate around educational equality in India. The distinction between the meritorious or casteless on one side and the reserved or caste-based on the other has allowed those who fall within the general category to invoke what Pierre Bourdieu calls, quote, an imaginary universe of perfect competition or perfect equality of opportunity, a world without inertia, without accumulation, without heredity or acquired properties, quote, unquote, in order to argue that it is reservations and not historical advantage that produces inequality and undermines equal citizenship. However, there's another side to the 1951 judgment that also lives on, and this is the definition of caste as culture, as natural aptitude, and as the very basis of merit. The judgment set the stage for a politics of self-definition through which Tamil Brahmins equated caste belonging with having merit, which they argued was threatened by the very existence of the reserved category. With the expansion of lower caste rights politics across India, this claim to merit as the non-reserved has become a more generalized phenomenon, seen not just in legal challenges to reservations, but in collective protests and in more everyday practices. In this sense, caste dynamics in Tamil Nadu set an important precedent for making the general category a putatively democratic norm, whose external limit is lower casteness. Let us now turn to the IITs to look more closely at how the Tamil Brahmin precedent set the stage for an expanding politics of meritocracy. As I noted earlier, three phenomena have been central to the making of upper caste identity at the IITs. The first is reservations. It was in the context of Tamil Brahmin legal challenges to reservations that IIT Madras was founded in 1959. As a central government institution exempt from regional caste quotas, it was quickly coveted by Tamil Brahmins as a meritocratic space, shielded from lower caste claims where talent would find its due. This changed in 1973 when central government quotas for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes were extended to the IITs. Although there was opposition from all of the IITs, it was IIT Madras that led the charge in condemning the move as government overreach and a violation of meritocracy. Still, the extreme marginality of the students admitted through the 1973 quota did little to destabilize an existing campus norm of IITians coming from families of upper caste civil servants with shared histories of education and employment. Within Tamil Nadu, it is Brahmins who historically form the core of this group. Unlike upper caste from other parts of India, Tamil Brahmins, as targets of Dravidianism, responded most defensively to the quota by claiming IIT Madras as their own. We see this in the story of Karthik, a Tamil Brahmin alumnus who characterized IIT Madras as the singular ambition of Tamil Brahmin boys shut out of regional education. For us, he told me, it was IIT Madras or nothing. All other colleges admit by caste, only IIT is by merit. Immediately after disavowing the presence of caste at the IITs, Karthik emphasized how much IIT Madras felt like home. He talked about the comforting sense of homecoming upon entering the campus, where Brahmin Tamil was commonplace and where he experienced a form of caste kinship between Tamil Brahmin students and professors, expressed in shared intellectual projects and invitations to family functions. But IIT Madras was not simply a site for Brahmin caste kinship within a so-called non-Brahmin region. Lower caste Tamils who gained admission through the general category were also assumed to be Brahmin. Gopi, a non-Brahmin alumnus, told me a story that captured this perfectly. He was changing his clothes when his Tamil Brahmin roommate inquired into the whereabouts of his punal. When I told him that I don't wear one, he paused and then asked, "Doesn't your mother get upset?" It never struck him that I was backward caste. In fact, I think he still assumes that I'm from a particularly liberal Brahmin family. Gopi's experience speaks not to the castelessness of the IITian, but to the assumption that any Tamil who gets in on merit is by definition Brahmin. Other forms of embodied cultural capital were also thought to reflect Brahminness. The display of bodily neglect was one. Ratty t-shirts, torn jeans, and chappals signaled a Brahmin background where the consumption of knowledge was prized above commodity consumption. By contrast, dressing well was indicative of being a nouveau riche lower caste who didn't truly value knowledge. These assumptions acquired a disciplining force. Parani, a lower caste student from Chennai, told me how he made a point of switching out his shoes for chappals when he came back to campus after weekends at home. It was just easier, he said, than standing out. This desire to erase difference is particularly telling in the context of a region where a history of quotas has brought increasing number of lower castes into previously upper caste institutional spaces. Here, IIT Madras serviced the need to once again differentiate high from low. As caste status boundaries were blurring in the wider region, within the walls of the institution, it was crucial to mark the lower caste Tamil as Brahmin. Moreover, lower caste students were forced to erase the complexity of their own history, to produce flattened forms of caste difference that aligned with expectations of who did or didn't have merit. How then did this regional dynamic set a precedent for a wider politics of meritocracy? In the 1990s, lower caste rights politics spread to other parts of India, resulting in the emergence of new constituencies and parties. One of the outcomes of this political ferment was the implementation in 1990 and 2006 of new central government quotas for OBCs that, when combined with the 1973 quota, expanded the reserve category to nearly half the student body of central government institutions like the IITs. As a result, what had been a regional interplay of non-Brahmin claims to rights and Brahmin claims to merit expanded nationally. But now, when such claims were articulated, they expressed not Brahminness, but a consolidated form of upper caste identity. The 1990 quota ignited a firestorm in North India, with students engaging in street protests and masquerading as vendors, sweepers, and shoe shiners in a graphic depiction of their future reduction to lower caste labor. At the same time, one of the accusations leveled against the quota was that it was responsible for the spread of casteism, even of caste consciousness. Echoing the 1951 judgment, its detractors defined the quota as a violation of the ideal of equality and the reserved as singularly undeserving. The 2006 quota further entrenched the opposition between general and reserved as widely shared categories through which the Indian public understood caste difference. In news articles, films, jokes, and online debates emerged an upside-down world where stigmatization and exclusion were the plight of the general category, and the reserved were illegitimate beneficiaries of state corruption. Unmistakable in such commentary was the outrage at the disruption of a natural order, where upper caste dominance was assumed to be a byproduct of talent and desert. At the IITs, the ramifications of expanding reservations have been far-reaching. The existence of an OBC quota has produced a more explicit association between the general category and being upper caste. Moreover, after 2008, private sector job recruiters have become vigilant about only hiring general category students. Several who got into IIT Madras through the 73 and 2006 quotas recounted their chagrin at being pointedly asked for their JEE rank at the final stage of job recruitment. Despite doing well up to that point, most didn't get the jobs. There's thus emerging a two-tier system of employment, which ensures that general category students are assumed to be upper caste, and only they are seen as legitimate IITians. To sum up this section, the expansion of reservations has expanded an identitarian politics of merit from regional to national scale. Just as Dravidianism catalyzed Tamil Brahmin claims to merit, now the expansion of lower caste rights nationally has led to a similarly reactive upper caste politics. Particularly in the context of higher education and private sector employment, the polarized categories of the general and the reserved have superseded more localized affiliations to become a new scale of caste difference. Still, the process of caste consolidation has not been smooth. The instability of upper caste identity becomes more evident when we consider the second phenomenon shaping dynamics at the IITs, and this is the mass examination. The mass examination is commonly taken as an index of modern meritocracy. Unlike earlier processes of selection that explicitly favored a high-born elite, the mass examination was underwritten by an ideology of middle-class achievement, where labor would find its just rewards. Its scale and finely calibrated set of ranked outcomes stood in for a process of objective evaluation beyond social and political influence. However, this assumption is belied by the structuring force of economic and social relations and the ideological power of cultural assumptions. As filtering mechanisms, mass examinations typically favor those who come from histories of education and have a facility with this technical instrument. A case in point is the JEE, the IIT entrance examination, which arguably represents the fullest realization of India's examination fetish. It is widely perceived as a near perfect measure of merit because the pan-Indian scope of the exam is assumed to filter only the best out of a vast pool of applicants. However, it has been anything but a democratizing force. As noted earlier, the majority of IITians used to be children of upper caste civil servants. Their parents, themselves participants in another All India ritual, the Union Public Service Commission exam, made a point of training their children to succeed in the intense competitiveness of examination culture. These structural continuities have made caste and class history key to exam success, even as perceptions of the UPSC and JEE as objective filters of individual ability have reinforced an ideology of meritocratic achievement. In this instance as well, a more explicit claim to merit as a caste trait was first expressed by Tamil Brahmins. From the 1940s, Tamil Brahmins who felt shut out of regional educational institutions and employment by the quota system invested heavily in exam preparation to enter central government schools, colleges, and bureaucracies, a phenomenon that one Tamil Brahmin IITian referred to as a caste culture of coaching. With the opening of IIT Madras, this caste culture was directed towards a new goal. I heard many stories of mothers, and it's always mothers, burning the midnight oil with their children, coaxing them to do practice tests so they could crack the JEE. There's a palpable sense within these accounts of both resentment and intellectual superiority, a combined claim to being a scapegoated and a uniquely deserving and talented caste. In the past 10 years, JEE coaching exam coaching that was once more of a Brahmin phenomenon has exploded into a billion-dollar industry. The expansion of coaching has shifted the class profile of students at IIT Madras to include a large contingent from rural upper caste families in Andhra Pradesh and Telangana. Their arrival, however, has not been met with equanimity. In a newspaper interview about the proliferation of coaching classes, a former director of IIT Madras clarified that he was, quote, looking for students with raw intelligence and not those with a mind prepared by coaching class tutors. The coaching classes only help students in mastering pattern recognition skills. With this, you cannot get students with raw intelligence, unquote. This notion of raw intelligence places the ideal IITian outside institutional or even social formation as a naturally talented individual with a native capacity for technical knowledge. In conversations with him and other IIT administrators, I heard their concerns that the coaching industry undermined the ability of the exam to test for those who were truly worthy, in the process admitting students through the general category who are not actually gifted. It's clear that this divide between the gifted and the coached is not about who attends coaching classes, because virtually all IITians do. So who then are the coached? When pushed on this, I heard that they were from less urban, professional, and English-speaking backgrounds. They were the ones who attended the so-called coaching factories, where learning was rote, unlike the more boutique conceptual classes attended by the urban middle class. As with the performance of bodily neglect, the distinction between the gifted and the coached is also understood through specific qualities. The one most mentioned was groupism. Students from coaching factories are routinely charged with changing campus culture by bringing in their regional affiliations and languages. Although Brahmin, Tamil, and Hindi are also heard quite commonly on campus, it's Telugu that is marked as regional and parochial. Of course, other forms of collectivity are key to what it means to be an IITian. I heard numerous stories of male bonding over all-night debates on everything from obscure mathematical formulas to the evidence of science in the Vedas. Such stories take place in the dorm room and not the classroom, and are key to institutional kinship. But it's only Telugu speakers who are taken as a disruptive collective presence. In some ways, it is these students who most destabilize the equation of merit with being upper caste. As noted earlier, the implementation of the 2006 quota has made it even easier to consign all lower caste students to the undeserving reserved category. But Telugu students are problematic because they are the wrong kind of upper caste. Their rote learning, bad English, and open embrace of regionalism blur the boundary between the general and the reserved in problematic ways. To recap again, at the IITs, the challenges to upper caste dominance posed by successive waves of reservation produced a polarized student body and an incessant diagnostics of caste to root out the undeserving. However, the entry of Telugu students has been unsettling, leading those from class histories of higher education and professional employment to distinguish themselves not just from lower castes, but from non-ideal upper castes, in order to claim merit as their exclusive property. That the claim to merit is in fact about property becomes clearer when we consider the final phenomenon, which is diasporic or transnational mobility. Caste inheritances have long been key to mobility. Here too, the Tamil Brahmin story prefigures a more widespread pattern. Over the 20th century, and in the face of lower caste demands for the redistribution of power and resources, Tamil Brahmins have used mobility from countryside to city, from public to private sector, and from South India to the north and to other countries as a means to secure their economic and social standing. In Tamil Brahmin narratives, mobility comes across as an expression of cultural genius that across successive generations has allowed them to preserve merit against the odds. The Tamil Brahmin use of mobility as a form of maneuver anticipated similar trends across India. In the post-independence period, diasporic mobility emerged as a key tool for a wide spectrum of upper castes looking to secure the conditions for capital accumulation in the face of lower caste demands for access to public education and state employment. From the 1960s, the US emerged as the favored destination and quickly became the most affluent and highly educated node of the diaspora. Diasporic success has been hugely significant for reinforcing the link between meritocracy and caste. With geographical distance from India and from challenges to caste entitlement, upper caste achievement abroad appears to be a form of self-made success. At the same time, the highly selective character of the US Indian diaspora makes easier a seamless equation between being upper caste, being Indian, and having merit. Within the US Indian diaspora, IIT alumni have been particularly active in shoring up their status as uniquely meritocratic individuals. Particularly after the information technology boom of the 1990s, IITians in Silicon Valley began forging a new claim to merit as the basis of achievement. Now, however, it was a form of racial merit through which they sought to make Indianness synonymous with technical ability and brand IIT with commodity value. The early 2000s was a critical time for this racial project. Various magazines featured articles on the IITs. Forbes did a story titled Indians of Silicon Valley. Business Week came out with India's genius factories. And in a more sardonic vein, Scott Adams, creator of the comic strip Dilbert, debuted an IITian named Ashok. But most important was a 2003 episode of the news show 60 Minutes on the IITs, a carefully curated bit of publicity featuring choice quotes from prominent alumni that made the case for diasporic success as a natural extension of an IIT education. One of the highlights of the piece is an interview with Vinod Khosla, the co-founder of Sun Microsystems, who observes that Fortune 500 headhunters favor IITians over almost anybody else. As he put it, if you're a WASP walking in for a job, you wouldn't have as much pre-assigned credibility as you do if you're an engineer from IIT. WASP stands for White Anglo-Saxon Protestant. This project of self-racialization has been yoked to the cultivation of entrepreneurship. The Indus Entrepreneurs, an organization started by IIT alumni in Silicon Valley, currently boasts a membership of over 13,000, and its list of mentors includes the most well-recognized Indian names in the corporate sector. In conversations with both senior mentors and junior members of the organization, it became obvious that the entrepreneurial ambitions of IITians are the most actively cultivated. When a group of IITians brings forward a proposal, they're almost guaranteed seed funding. These expressions of transnational institutional kinship have both underwritten the commodity value of an IIT education and enhanced the racial mystique around the IITian's intellect. Together, such media events and institutional mechanisms have worked to elevate the status of the IITs and their diasporic ambassadors. But they've also produced new schisms between diasporic and homeland IITians. It's clear from speaking to Silicon Valley's IITians that they share an imagination of constraint and possibility. As do homeland alumni, they insist that in India, they were limited by a system that fostered mediocrity in the name of democracy, and where the IITs were islands of meritocracy. But there's also something new. In their embrace of entrepreneurial wealth accumulation as the basis of merit, IITians in Silicon Valley are increasingly at odds with an older upper caste orientation around higher education and lifelong professional employment. Moreover, although most are the children of civil servants and public sector engineers, they've gone from being beneficiaries of the developmental state to its most strident detractors. Significantly, their disdain for the Indian public sector now also extends to homeland IITians. As they see it, Indian conditions have forced IITians who stayed behind to slip into mediocrity, with the result that only the diasporic IITian truly embodies brand IIT. The diasporic project of brand elevation has certainly had an impressive reach. When I asked IIT students in the late 2000s about their role models, most mentioned Silicon Valley entrepreneurs. They also use the language of branding to define their own value. Sandeep, a 2009 alumnus, pointed out that one's branch of engineering was no longer relevant. Even though they haven't done any related courses, everyone is going into finance and business and marketing, he told me. Adding that despite their disregard for the engineering curriculum, IITians still get the best jobs because of the brand name. IIT Madras now offers a Master's of Science in Entrepreneurship, and a student-run entrepreneurship cell aims to foster an entrepreneurship culture on campus. Many Homeland alumni also endorse the diasporic branding project as good for the institution. As one put it, quote, "The brand is a kind of ISO mark. You're assured of quality, like when you see a car made in Japan, it immediately sells." However, not everyone echoed these commitments to branding and entrepreneurship. When I asked one Homeland alumnus to compare alumni activity in the US and India, he responded without skipping a beat. In USA, it's brand building. Here, it's nation building. As examples of nation builders, he offered a diverse list of alumni, including an Ayurvedic doctor, a school principal, a minister of environment, a petroleum secretary, some journalists, and the head of an NGO working in primary education. These are all IITians who contributed to the development of the country, he said pointedly, but all you hear about now is Silicon Valley. Another alumnus who now teaches at IIT Madras confided that the entrepreneurship craze, as he called it, was demoralizing for faculty, whose students were far more interested in attracting the attention of venture capitalists than in learning the curriculum. Now, instead of engineering, he remarked in frustration, all they want to understand is the business of business. Particularly noteworthy was the stance of some Tamil Brahmin alumni who expressed a distaste for the blatant embrace of accumulation, which they felt was more aligned with a mercantile sensibility. They spoke of this as a disturbing departure from an older model of ascetic intellectualism that they claimed was a trademark characteristic of IIT Madras. One expressed his disquiet by saying, all these good Brahminical values that, at least in the minds of some people in the South, used to mean that you should be good in academics and intellectual pursuits, that should be the overriding ambition, and you shouldn't be taken in by all of these material things. All of that has vanished. This invocation of bygone Brahminical values speaks volumes about the continuing transformation of upper caste identity. As with the opposition between the general and the reserved, and the gifted and the coached, new tensions have arisen between intellectual and entrepreneurial conceptions of merit. The diasporic model of merit, in which entrepreneurial wealth accumulation is elevated as its true measure, has not been embraced by all IITians. To their surprise, those who were once emblematic of upper caste meritocracy now find themselves resisting its most recent manifestation. So to conclude, in post-independence India, new patterns of caste stratification and consolidation have emerged through the very process of democratic change. Rather than the gradual erosion of caste, what we're witnessing is the leveraging of merit as an expression of upper caste identity, aimed at securing arenas of expertise and accumulation against democratizing changes. Such claims to merit make the inheritances of caste into markers of individual achievement. Tamil Nadu is an important precedent for understanding this process. By throwing into relief caste advantage as the basis of achievement, Dravidianism forced Tamil Brahmins into a reactive claim to merit as an expression of caste culture. From the 1990s, this dynamic expanded nationally, making more explicit the equation between caste and merit and polarizing consolidated groupings of upper and lower castes. Exam coaching was one spanner in the works that forced a redefinition of merit as both a caste and a class characteristic. And while in many respects diasporic mobility allowed for more unfettered accumulation, the project of racial self-definition has found detractors among homeland alumni who contest the equation of upper caste merit with entrepreneurial success. What does this process suggest for our understanding of democracy? For one, the claim to merit as upper caste property calls into question the widespread assumption that only lower castes engage in identity politics. Rather, we must see the claim to merit as an example of an identity politics aimed at shoring up historical advantages and forestalling progress towards a more egalitarian society. Second, the shifting expressions of upper caste identity and the shifting spaces of capital accumulation from land to central government employment, the domestic private sector, and the diaspora show the instability of privilege and the work it takes to maintain the upper hand. Finally, these shifts in upper caste identity speak to the force of political opposition and the need to understand merit as a reactive claim against efforts at democratization. Thanks. So that's the talk. I hope most of you stayed with me through that.
Yes.
So let me just ask Krishna to start the conversation.
Thank you, Ajantha. You can't hear the applause, but I'm sure there is an applause. Thank you for a lovely talk. Well, I just want to first say that there's tremendous amount of convergence and overlaps between how the world of the classicals, the world of upper caste art, or so-called upper caste art, has framed itself over the last 100 years. and with the whole IIT and knowledge-based discriminative systems that we have evolved. And a lot of things you say has resonance in the world of Carnatic music or classical music. For example, even Janki Bakale's work has a lot of resonance to what you're saying in terms of how these negotiations are constantly being done in order to, shall we say, fortify and reinvent and rediscover a new way to control a social system. So I will be touching upon that in our conversation, but I want to first pick your brain on an expression you used, which I found very interesting: instability of privilege. Because that's not something that we usually hear. Privilege is taken to be something that's very stable, very solid, and that in some way people in privilege are, that the fact that the privileged work towards making sure that they're secure in privilege is never discussed. And this term instability of privilege actually directly points to the fact that the privileged actually work consciously, unconsciously, politically, socially, whatever, to make sure that that control system is still there. So can you just talk about that a bit?
Yeah, sure. So this is, I think, what my work adds. I mean, I've built on a lot of other scholarship, and I've only mentioned two other scholars in my talk, Pierre Bourdieu and Satish Deshpande, but there are others who have also talked about the operations of caste privilege, right? In India, there's a huge scholarship on this. What I'm trying to foreground in my work is this interplay, right, between upper caste dominance, right, of certain institutional and social spaces and pushback against this dominance, right? And what happens in the face of pushback, right? And this is what I call processes of democratization, right? That all the way through, you see lower caste, you see the marginalized, not simply accepting their lot, right? But you see them, engaging in forms of democratic politics, engaging in forms of collective protest, right? To make demands, right? To lay claim to spaces which they have previously been excluded from. And this is where I think the Tamil Brahmin case is so interesting and important, right? Because Tamil Nadu is one context in which you see the sort of successful capture of the state, right? By groups that previously had less power, right? Less political power, less social power. So you see the capture of the state, and you see efforts at redistributing social capital, efforts like the implementation of quotas, right? And so in that context, what do groups like Tamil Brahmins do, right? And that's what to me is so interesting, is what do elites do in the face of democratic pushback, right? How do they reconstitute themselves, right? How do they lay claim to a certain set of privileges, right? And how does their language change, right? In order to navigate a new set of circumstances. So for me, merit is such an interesting instance of the use of a new language, right? The use of a new language to justify, right, certain forms of hegemony, right? And so, as I said at the very outset of the talk, the pushback against reservations, for instance, is hardly ever done in the language of caste, right? It's in the language of merit that this pushback happens. And so that's right there, you see how democratization, right, has not just allowed new spaces of political action, right, for lower caste. It has also introduced a new language of politics, right? It's introduced new languages of self-definition and self-justification. And the sort of politics of meritocracy is a really important an illuminating space in which to see this playing out.
So, very funnily, the whole democratic process
Yes.
is the reason for the instability, because exactly. So the democratic environment allows for multiple voices, allows for pushback, allows for structural changes that then autocracy and all the other strong systems want to resist. And so in a way, the instability is caused by the whole sense of social freedom and democratic setup, which is not natural to the elite system of functioning. But then to what you said about merit, I just want to know, is merit really a new idea, or is it a rediscovery of an old notion? Why I'm asking you this is that in most upper caste homes, you'll always hear the conversation that caste is never an issue because caste is never spoken about. And you'll always hear words like knowledge, wisdom, intellectualism. So, for example, academic is just an extension of that. Or Vedas or Upanishads. You can add all that. As all of them being identifiers of being Brahmin and of being an evolved person. So I'm just wondering whether merit is just a manifestation of that in a socio-political context, or what is new about the way it is being used? What is new about that?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that's a great question. It's certainly not the case that there aren't older languages of status, right? And self-distinction, right? That continue to be in play. I mean, absolutely, there are older languages. The reason why merit, I think, is such an important term is because merit is consistent with certain sort of conceptions of democracy, right? So what does merit do? It allows for kind of older social hierarchies, right, to be reframed, right, as legitimate bases for social stratification, right? So when you say, okay, the JEE exam is a kind of democratic, it's a more democratic basis, right, for admission, for evaluation, for admission into a set of elite institutions. I mean, what are you exactly saying by that? You're saying that despite the highly uneven outcomes of an exam like that, right, where you clearly see, right, that certain social groups have had historical advantages, right? I mean, there's no other way of explaining why.
Absolutely.
A far greater percentage of upper caste get through the exam than others. How do you explain that, right? Except through recourse to notions of historical advantage and disadvantage. But what the exam as a democratic instrument does, is that it allows you to sort of reframe those outcomes, right? As the results of individual ability, right? Right? That these are not people who belong to a kind of historically stratified historically stratified society. These are individuals who, by dint of their own effort, right, by dint of their own kind of natural abilities, right, have been able to succeed. So it's a way, meritocracy is a way of reconciling, right, historically derived hierarchies, right, and notions of fairness, a level playing field, right, democratic equality, right? It helps you to sort of reconcile these two things and make them seem consistent with each other.
Absolutely,
right?
yeah, absolutely.
And in such a way that then the quota becomes the basis of unfairness.
Yeah,
right?
it almost, the quota almost becomes the oppressor.
Sorry?
I said the quota almost becomes the oppressor.
It becomes the oppressor because it seems to be a kind of an intervention in an otherwise fair system.
Exactly.
Right? So merit is a way of sort of advancing the proposition that that formal democracy, that democracy is actually an equalizing process, right? That the institution of democracy is has actually equalized the playing field. Right?
Yeah, because merit is seen as as an output of a democratic process, and therefore you think that it's enabling that. Yeah,
so it really obscures the difference between formal equality and substantive equality.
Yes, absolutely. Right? Yes.
Yeah.
And pick on one other thing you said in your talk and in your book you mentioned is about when a person from marginalized sections of society gets into IIT, and the cultural complexity of their being or identity needs to be either buried or hidden in some fashion, and the struggle that happens there. And I just want you to talk about that a bit, because that's something people do not talk about. Even when they talk about caste, they don't realize about what happens when a person from marginalized section needs to, within quotes, fit in to what is a very, very hardened upper caste-ish environment, intellectually, socially, culturally, religiously, and what it means for a person like that. And can you just talk about, it's not in your talk, but you can just talk about through your interviews what you learned about this cultural readjustment that is needed.
Yeah. So one of the things that was really striking in the interviews that I did was this sharp contrast between sort of upper caste interviewees, right, who sort of consistently disavowed the presence of caste feeling, right, on campus, and OBC and SC interviewees who were acutely aware of the caste culture of the campus, right? And they experienced it as a minefield, right, that they had to navigate. So this kind of remarkable opposition between these two experiences of the same campus, right? Yeah. Right. Really throws into relief, the sort of everyday operations of caste, right? And how it structures even the most mundane of interactions, right, on a campus like the IITs. Everything from the use of dialect, right?
Yep.
Which marks you. Your facility with English, which marks you, right? And this is quite apart from the more what we typically think about, right, as kind of marking a political identity, support or opposition to reservations. I mean, that's a kind of much more sort of obvious indication, right? Obvious sort of indicator of caste belonging. But it's these sort of like everyday ways in which caste belonging gets expressed, right? Which are so difficult to point to and so easily disavowed, right?
Absolutely.
And they become sort of so much the fabric of your everyday life that that to call attention to them makes it seem as if, again, is as if you're the person who is introducing caste into the equation, right? And so that becomes a kind of deterrent to upper caste, to lower caste students saying anything, right? And that, I think, is partly what keeps a culture of caste in place, right? Is sort of the sense that, if you call attention to it, somehow you're being a disruptive presence, right?
Yeah.
That it's easier to allow a kind of, institutional culture to persist as such, right? And this obviously, it doesn't just relate to caste. I mean, this also relates to the operations of race on a campus such as mine, right?
Absolutely.
Where there are certain ways in which whiteness, and of course a certain sort of class form of whiteness, right, operates as a kind of institutional norm, right? And it's so difficult to point to because of how everyday it is, right? How it's kind of embedded in the most mundane of interactions. But the kind of the sort of psychological effect, right, of this sort of everyday culture cannot be overstated, right? And
Absolutely.
It leads to what people have called impostor syndrome, right?
Exactly. The stories you just narrated are very similar. You hear the same stories in IT companies when it's just a conversation over lunch or over a festival, when a person doesn't belong to the Brahmin world, cannot participate in that conversation, but it's taken for granted that the person is part of this culture. And there is this alienation which is never discussed. And like you pointed out, if that individual actually pointed to it, then you're the person who is bringing caste into the picture. And your Punal example, which you just gave in your talk, I know exactly the same in the world of music, where a young man was asked why he had never wore his cross thread, and it didn't even appear in the mind of the questioner that person couldn't be. And that's the most fascinating part, that even through the conversation, the person realized. But now that you spoke about, these markers and IITs, now this whole, again, the question of meritocracy, question of it being an oasis of genuine seeking of intellectual gravitas by people who deserve it in some fashion. Is that also the fundamental reason why the IITs want to place themselves as being beyond the political, beyond any political conversation? For example, all that happened with the Ambedkar Periyar Study Circle, for example, in IIT Madras. I'd like to directly talk about that in this context, because the humanities, for example, I know is seen by the scientific world within IIT Madras as being disruptive by its very construction. The fact that there is social sciences and there is history being discussed and politics being discussed in an engineering institution means automatically they're dirtying the place, muddying the place with unnecessary things. So what is this connection between technological engineering knowledge by the upper caste community and the fact that anything that's got to do with the humanities, and also the belief that those in those areas of work are automatically disruptive, questioning, and possibly also don't belong to the same social bracket to a large extent. So in a way, we do have an upper caste notion that the humanities is intellectually less rigorous than science and engineering. So I'm just wondering how much that is played out in the IIT environment, especially IIT Madras, for example, because that's the focus, and how much they push back on any political conversation or anything that asks difficult questions of themselves or of the country or of what's happening.
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting question about what is specific to the technical, right? I mean, what is it about this form of knowledge that seems to be completely divorced from larger social or political dynamics, right? And yes, I mean, a lot of people have pointed to the sort of ideology of technoscience, right? As supposedly socially disembedded, right?
Yes.
I mean, this is a form of knowledge which somehow operates in a kind of social vacuum, right? And which is also what contributes to its perception as purely objective, right? That there's a sort of truth to technoscience, right? That it is not about interpretation, right? It's not about social positionality, right? That it's a kind of that it's a form of hard truth, right? Which is completely different from these other more interpretive, kind of softer forms of knowledge, right? Yeah. And yes, I mean, there's a huge literature in the sort of history of science and in science and technology studies, which sort of calls the lie to this assumption, right? that science and society are somehow separate from each other, right? That the technical and the political are distinct. And this literature kind of points to both the operations of ideology, right, within kind of technoscientific institutions, and also the forms of social privilege, right? These forms of knowledge help to underwrite. So in all of these ways, this scholarship has really kind of blurred the boundary, right, between the scientific and the political, or the technical and the social. I mean, what's interesting looking back at caste and the professions, so the first chapter of my book, part of what I try to do is ask the question of why upper castes who previously disdained the technical, right? The technical as a kind of form of embodied skill that was more proper to the low-born, right? Why is it that upper castes came to monopolize this sphere of knowledge, right? I mean, how did that happen? I mean, I said in my talk that in many ways, the technical sciences should have been the space of lower caste. These should have been lower caste pursuits, right? Because of the history of technical skill, which is much more evident, right, within lower caste populations. And so one of the things that you see is that, the upper caste orientation around the technical sciences happens once engineering itself becomes redefined as conceptual. Right? Once engineering becomes redefined as a conceptual form of knowledge, right? So that distinction between the practical and the conceptual, right? The embodied and the conceptual, that becomes key to the upper caste attraction, right? Which kind of speaks to your point about the conceptual having had this kind of older association with the upper caste, right? And now it's sort of carrying through into these sort of newer fields like engineering. So it's no surprise that the IITs are seen as the most conceptual of the engineering colleges, right?
Yeah, and I think it's very similar, the whole notion of knowledge and skill. I mean, this is actually the process of knowledge creation, establishing something as knowledge, as value, and vis-a-vis keeping something else as a skill, as something that's embodied in their body, in a social structure, and therefore never get into a point of where it is structured into an ideational, conceptual, knowledge-based system. And I think that's why, like you pointed out, the world of the real world, political world, has no space there. And it's not very different from the world of art, which is what is fascinating. If you look at the world of the so-called classicals, it's still seen as a world of the conceptual. You may listen to the music, you may see the painting, but it's the world of the conceptual. And therefore, exactly the same arguments that you place are placed in the world of the classical systems across the globe, of it being caste blind, it being non-discriminative, because it's about the idea and the pursuit of the idea. I have, we can go on, but I'm just going to ask you two questions, and I think take some questions from there, many questions for you. But I have one question I want to specifically ask you about universities in the United States. To my knowledge, universities seem totally caste blind in the United States. So when you have South Asians coming in, how conscious are universities about the sheer homogeneousness that they have created through their educational system of not recognizing caste as being a very sharp discriminative process? And which is why, whether it's the academic world, whether it's a student population, I mean, now it's also the diaspora, which is again feeding into the same community or the bandwidth of the same community again and again and again. Is there something happening that's going to change that specifically? Because the mobility of people who are marginalized is so much harder. not just because of their history, but also because they can't even imagine the possibility of applying to Harvard, or applying beyond their district, beyond their town. So what is the academic world of the United States doing to address something that is staring right at their face?
Very little is the short answer. To my knowledge, the only university which has included caste, right, in its non-discrimination policy is Brandeis, and this is very recent, right? This is last. So yes, you're right. Caste has been a non-category, at least in terms of public spaces, right? Public institutional spaces. It's a non-category in the US. And the efforts to introduce caste, right, into the school curriculum, for instance, in the US, has faced fierce pushback, right, from the Indian diaspora. So I'm forgetting now which year this was, but in California, there was an effort to introduce caste, right, into the curriculum on Hinduism. Right? And this is at the kind of school level. This is not the college level. And the sort of the Hindu diaspora mobilized. And what was interesting about their pushback is that it was framed in terms of racial minority sentiment, right? And so this was framed. The introduction of caste was seen as a denigration, right, of racial minority religious sentiment.
Okay.
And so you see there how there's a very specific way in which the effort to render caste a non-category and to sort of prevent its operationalization within policy, it takes a very specific form in the US, right? Because Indians are a minority. And so they get to kind of use that to say that this is yet another instance of, Orientalist denigration, right?
Okay.
This is yet another instance of Indians being treated as somehow non-modern or primitive, right? So the fact that this is a kind of fault line within the Indian community, right, gets very conveniently effaced, right, in favor of kind of foregrounding this other fault line, right, between a minority and a racial majority. So, I mean, the same has happened in the UK, right? I mean, there are all of these efforts to try to introduce caste-based, caste discrimination, right, as a sort of important part of a kind of larger policy of non-discrimination within institutional spaces. And there's been crazy pushback. And you're seeing a kind of interesting alignment between more affluent sections of both diasporas, right, and a kind of conservative politics, right? So, I mean, you have increasing numbers of Indian Americans who are shifting from Democrat to Republican. You have, Hindus for Trump and all this other stuff. You also have had, I don't know whether you followed this, but there was this interesting moment where, as Trump was trying to politicize the border wall and prevent, and sort of clamp down on illegal immigration, you had a group of Indians taking to the streets and distinguishing themselves as legal and deserving migrants, right, from the illegal, undeserving migrants. And so so this idea of being a model minority is leveraged in all kinds of different ways in the US. And one way is to kind of basically sort of put a ceiling on the sort of caste question, right?
Question completely.
It doesn't serve it. Yeah.
We can go on, but you have loads of questions, and I'm going to try and you're most welcome to pick a few. I'm just going to take the first one, where is that? Just to give me a second. I'm just going to. Okay, the first question I'm just speaking is from.
Perhaps we can scroll through and see.
I'm Kanav Sagal. What do you see the future of caste-based discrimination in India? Concomitantly, has your research unearthed any instances of Indian communities that are well on the way to annihilate caste, the way Dr. Ambedkar envisaged?
I mean, there's a very, very strong and ongoing anti-caste politics, right? As Dr. Ambedkar said, I mean, one of the reasons why caste has the sort of resilience that it does, right, is because it's a form of graded inequality, right? But there's always somebody above you and somebody below you, right?
Yeah.
So it is to your advantage to sort of enhance your own status, right, relative to those beneath you, instead of engaging in a politics of solidarity against caste as such. And I think this is precisely what allows for the persistence of caste. But yes, there are very strong and in some senses successful, right, anti-caste struggles. I think they have a long distance to go. I think that this question is better put to somebody who studies anti-caste politics. I mean, my project is all about sort of upper caste identity formation, right? And the effort to leverage forms of privilege, right, precisely against efforts to both enhance lower caste status and to annihilate caste, right? So, yeah, I think that there's a long way to go. I think that annihilating caste cannot simply be a matter of policy, right? I think policy interventions can only go so far. I mean, I think what it requires is a social revolution of ideas, right? I mean, one of the things that my work shows is that forms of stigma can travel, right? They can, stigma sort of takes new forms and inhabits the most modern of institutional spaces, right? I mean, it really takes a kind of revolutionizing of the idea of equality, right? Like what it requires giving up inherited and very strongly held understandings of social hierarchy, right?
I'm taking the next question because it's close to an observation made by the Supreme Court of India today.
Yes.
Supreme Court today, it was a case from Telangana that came in about 100% reservation for SE in tribal schools, in tribal schools of Telangana. And the Supreme Court made observation today saying affluent within this SEST are not permitting benefits to trickle down to the needy. I'm just, I think, more or less quoting from what was said. I'm taking this because the question is it's from YouTube, it's from Lekha Naidu that says, do comment on the argument that those students whose parents have already received the benefits of caste reservation and have economic and social capital should be excluded from caste reservation. She's also pointing to the creamy layer. And the Supreme Court has made a similar observation today. Of course, they've said many things, but this specific line is connected to that question. So I want your take on this whole creamy layer argument, which is, again, a very sensitive argument in caste discussions in India.
Yeah. So I think it should be acknowledged that the creamy layer argument is often a sort of pernicious way of critiquing reservations as such, right? The same is true in the United States when it comes to affirmative action, right? There's a sort of consistent pointing to sort of privileged Black people, right? Sort of middle-class Blacks who are monopolizing affirmative action, right? To the and disadvantaging those who are truly deserving, right? Now, I mean, one of the questions that I think this raises is who can actually take advantage of the quota, right? And especially when it comes to quotas in elite institutional spaces like the IITs, right? You have to already be at a certain kind of a certain socioeconomic status, right? Mm-hmm. To even aspire to a seat in an institution like the IITs, right? So often the creamy layer argument is sort of sidesteps that reality, right? That the truly disadvantaged, you know, as is pointed out, find it very difficult, right, to compete for these kinds of spots, right? Now that said, and you know, I think it's worth also noting a certain pattern in who makes these arguments, right? Right? Who makes these arguments and on behalf of who, right? So it's often an incredibly paternalistic argument, right? That's made by social elites on behalf of, you know, the truly disadvantaged and against this kind of intermediate rung with whom they're in direct competition, right? So it's an expression of patronage, which is also an expression of sort of competition, right? With this sort of intermediate rung, with the creamy layer, who are a more direct threat, right? To the social reproduction of privilege. It's also, I think, I don't know, I mean, there's a part of me that thinks, you know, the efforts to sort of scale back or fine tune reservations here and affirmative action in the US sort of rest on this idea that somehow these should be short-term measures, right, in the path towards a true equality, right, where you know, sort of where these forms of compensatory discrimination, right, are no longer necessary. Now, what is that point, right? At what point have we achieved an equality where group-based social differences are no longer evident? I mean, when you look at, you know, institutions across the board in India, it's still the case that they don't represent the sort of demographic weight, right, of different social groups. So they still overwhelmingly favor, and you know, this gets worse and worse as you move up the sort of institutional hierarchy. They overwhelmingly favor historically advantaged populations over others, right? So at what point have we reached a point, right, when reservations should no longer matter? Like where is it when, I mean, ideally it should be when, right, the social makeup of an institution mirrors the social makeup of society, right, as a whole. We're far from that point. So I mean, I think these are sort of different ways that I would address the creamy layer question, right? Yeah. That is often a kind of mischievous argument, right? Yeah. That's in favor of the truly disadvantaged and against those who are a direct threat to the social reproduction of privilege. And that, it expresses a kind of a larger preoccupation with sort of ending forms of collective compensatory discrimination altogether. For me, it really sort of, I certainly don't think we've gotten to that point yet, right? When these things are sort of obsolete. And I don't know that we are going to at any point soon.
Yeah. I just want to correct myself. That question was from Shwetanshu Bora on YouTube. So apologies for not mentioning the right name. There are, Ajantha, there are tons of questions. We can just go on. But just want to say there's one interesting anonymous comment which I should share, is about the humanities space in IITs. And this anonymous attendee says that one manifestation of this outside the space of IITM is in matrimonial sites. For instance, there is an online matrimonial site called iitIIMshadi.com. However, that website doesn't allow the enlisting of humanities and social science students as IITians. This is because HSS students are deemed as pseudo-IITians. So just thought that's an interesting comment to share. Okay, then our next question I'm picking, I don't know how much time we have. Take one more question maybe, and we'll wrap. Ravi, somebody from DIC? Okay, I can't hear you. You need to.
We can go on for another 15 minutes,
Okay.
till 7:45. Yeah.
Okay, great. So this is from GK Karanth. Isn't the so-called upper caste monopoly over merit that's being gradually eroded, posing a newer form of confrontation at the IITs? Are the OBCs imitating the formerly upper caste patterns of intellectual snobbery and minimizing the likelihood of instability of privileges?
Look, I mean, Tamil Nadu is a sort of perfect example of how the sort of the graded inequalities of caste trickle all the way down, right? So this is not just about sort of, Brahmins and non-Brahmins. I mean, among non-Brahmins, there are sort of intractable, right, forms of relative status, right? And the kind of effort to keep Dalits in particular in their place, right? And now, I mean, what's interesting is that, before the OBC quota was extended to the IITs, I did interviews with OBC students who attended the IITs and graduated before the extension of the quota, right? And one of the sort of pushbacks I got from them was that this argument about meritocracy that I'm making goes too far. And the reason they thought it went too far is because they felt like it undercut their own claim to merit, right? So they were sort of very quick to point out that the general category is not just an upper caste category, that there are many of them who got in through merit, right? And should be sort of recognized for accomplishments. Now, I think that this is, and while that's undoubtedly true, right? That that it is important to recognize that, intellectual ability, right, is not a monopoly of one social group. I think what this sort of need to kind of proclaim your own sort of meritocratic status as an OBC person, what that does is, yes, I mean, I think it sort of reproduces this idea that there is a sort of fundamental difference, right, between those who have merit and those who don't, right? The other way that becomes within the IITs, I think the difference between the OBC students and the SC/ST students is very much there, right? Now, I think that sort of, and it was more acute before the 2006 quota. After the 2006 quota, I mean, my sense is that there really have been efforts at kind of bridging that gap. I mean, the Ambedkar-Periyar Study Circle is one example of that. I mean, in the very name, Ambedkar-Periyar Study Circle, there's this kind of expression of a solidarity, right? Across that boundary between OBC and SC. But it is certainly the case that sort of Dalit students feel, uniquely stigmatized, right, at the IITs, which sort of mirrors their experience in the wider society, right? That they're the objects of discrimination, not just on the part of upper caste, but also on the part of, intermediate castes, right? So I think it remains to be seen how, what the kind of long-term impact of the OBC quota will be on the IITs. At the moment, I mean, if anything, I think the election of Modi and the willingness of the Modi government to intervene in the most sort of direct ways on central government campuses to sort of align itself with sort of a kind of Hindutva leaning and sort of upper caste student body over and against the rest. I mean, I think that this fault line is in some ways the sort of the more consequential one at the moment, right? So I think in some ways it's put a lid on the kinds of tensions between OBC and SC students that might have arisen, right? Because this other sort of division has sort of taken precedence. But yeah, I'm certainly not sort of denying that, that the kind of OBC SC tensions have dissipated. And in fact, I think in some ways they're as important to attend to as these other tensions. Yeah.
Next question is from Rajesh Ramakrishnan. Once looked down upon as capitation institutions, the higher educational landscape is now dominated by private institutions and universities, where the student's ability to pay for education is important. How does this complicate the caste versus merit debate?
I mean, what's so interesting is that privatization of education and the imposition of capitation fees are not as much of a target of the sort of meritocracy debates, right? As reservations, and they should be, right? I mean, they should be much more of a focus than they are, given the kind of rapid expansion of private education, right? So I think it's sort of significant that's not seen as a kind of mechanism for sort of undercutting merit, right? To the same degree that reservations are. So I'll just sort of put that out there. Yeah, I mean, I have looked at the sort of uppermost echelons of the public education system in India, right? I think the much larger problem is the undercutting of education as a right? Through rampant privatization, right? I mean, that is a much more sort of fundamental problem, right? That really gets at the heart of the equalization of opportunity, right? And yes, I mean, I think it's it's a scandal, right? That education costs what it does in a country like India.
Yeah.
I mean, the same is true of the United States, right? I mean, since the mid 20th century, the United States, which prided itself, right, on making education and higher education in particular accessible, right, and the basis for sort of middle class mobility. I mean, that sort of mid-century democratic promise has been almost completely eradicated, right? So, and I think the same is true in India, right? I mean, education is, as a means to social mobility, is less and less, it's less and less available to people, right? And this is not just about privatization, it's also about the eradication of vernacular education, right? The privileging of English over and above all other media has had a similar sort of devastating impact, right, on education as a kind of fundamental right. So I think both of these things, I mean, scaling back privatization, but also, equalizing, right, English and other media, right, as sort of equally legitimate and provable means to social mobility. I think that those there has to be a sort of renewed commitment to these things.
But I think the problem also starts with school education, the whole private school education as being, and a lot of what you've built on is also reflected in school education in terms of, which are seen as playgrounds of knowledge where upper caste will send their children. The need for social mobility also saying, depending on which school you send your child, therefore people from other castes move to convents and then try to move to more elite private schools. So it's kind of, that's feeding into the IIT syndrome automatically, right? I'm going to finally ask you one question, which is a question that I know we've been asked, is why are two upper caste people having this conversation? One, shouldn't the conversation have been between you and a Dalit, or a Dalit also as part of the panelist? Why is this conversation between you and me? And I want your thoughts on that.
Look, I mean, I certainly think that this is a conversation that that should be had over and over and over again, right? Among sort of various constituencies. I think that there's more of a need for upper castes to reflect on their own privilege and to understand the bases of their own social reproduction, right? I mean, as I said, in response to Krishna's question about the operations of caste sentiment on a campus like IIT Madras, lower castes are acutely aware and informed about the operations of caste, right? They have no problem seeing the social landscape of India as a caste landscape, right? I think it's upper caste, it's those of us who sort of think of ourselves as somehow having transcended caste, right? We think of ourselves as casteless. I mean, we're the ones who need to be schooled, right? In the sort of in the operations of caste, and how, regardless of whether we think of ourselves as having caste sentiments, how we are the beneficiaries of caste, right? We are the beneficiaries of caste structures that have endured and in some ways even been strengthened, right, over the post-independence period. So it's actually important for upper caste to have this conversation, right? And of course, it doesn't have to be just amongst ourselves, but it's a conversation that needs to be had, right? And it's actually more urgent for upper caste to have this conversation, right? And come to a reckoning with their own privilege. I mean, it's a way of saying, the burden is on us, right? the burden should not be on lower caste to educate us about our privilege, or to educate us in the ways of, I mean, this is, again, not to constantly sort of analogize with the US, but this happens over and over again, right? Where it's the Black person who's supposed to educate the white person, right? About their own privilege. And I think it's exhausting. It's exhausting for lower castes and for Black people and other marginalized groups to continuously sort of force the conversation, right? We have to be willing to have it ourselves.
Yeah. And I just want to say one thing, and I don't think the conversation is about the past; it's about the present.
Absolutely.
Because there's also tendency among so-called upper caste privileged communities to think of discussing caste as being saying sorry for the past. No, it's not. It is actually a realization of the present and your own participatory nature in the present. And that's as important in the larger spectrum of multiple conversations that we have in realizing in the way we are operative and the way we operationalize so many things that we do on an everyday basis. And your work, pretty much is about how, if the so-called upper caste create these systems, modifies these systems to retain this whole sense of privilege and control over education, knowledge, or cultural systems, aesthetics too. And therefore, I would just conclude by telling all of you to read the book, The Caste of Merit. Please do read the book. It's a fascinating book. And I've always been a fan of Ajantha's writings, read her many times. And this book is a great way for us to understand how the privileged operationalize their own privilege again and again and again and again.
Thank you so much, Ajantha. Thank you so much, Krishna. The books have now been classified as essential services, so do buy the book, and you can order it, and it'll be, delivered. For the panelists, you must know, we'd like to inform you that, our YouTube audiences are having a very vibrant discussion amongst themselves, on YouTube. Thank you, audiences on YouTube. Thank you, audiences on Zoom. For those of you who are not on our mailing list, do sign up to our mailing list. We hope to see you here on Sunday. And thank you again.
Thank you so much. This was a really enjoyable discussion.